Have you ever found yourself stuck in a relationship with someone who seems impossible to understand? No matter how hard you try, they just don't seem to get you. So what do? Gordon asked me what actually sparks change in these dynamics. This conversation is about how to engage narcissistic dynamics without escalating them, by shifting from labels and facts to process, containment, and moment-to-moment understanding. This approach is relevant whether you're living with someone who may be exhibiting narcissistic patterns, or if you're starting to recognize these tendencies in yourself. Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. If you listened to last week's episode, you may recall that Gordon Brewer, host of the Practice of Therapy podcast and coach with over 20 years of experience working with narcissistic dynamics in relationships, joined me here as a guest. I mentioned that we had a full agenda and didn't get through everything I hoped to cover with him, so we continued the conversation on his channel. We hadn't had the chance to fully unpack some of the most important questions, such as, what does healing actually look like in narcissistic relationships? And how do you begin that healing? Gordon and I get into all of this and much more, sharing practical insights for partners, therapists, and anyone navigating what we call high conflict relationships. We can also call those personality disordered relationships. I hope you find our conversation meaningful and helpful as you think about your own situation. Let's get into it.
Yeah, I know I meant to mention this at the beginning, but one of the things that Anthony and I have done is I was on his podcast or interviewed for his podcast here in the last week or two, and we talked about it talked about narcissism in the context of relationships and just what I've learned, just clinically over working with couples, and particularly if there's one that has identified as having narcissistic personality disorder. But I'm curious, Anthony, as you think about it, how do you tend to define it? And we've got the DSM definition of it, but just wondering how you tend to think about it.
I'm so glad, and this is one thing on my podcast that I mentioned. I'm just telling your listeners that I was so impressed with the mature and sort of comprehensive way that you think about things, Gordon, and you're doing it already, because you mentioned we have the DSM. It's like DSM, I don't know, we're up to maybe 5 at this point.
Right.
And it's getting better, but it's limited in the sense that it looks more at what we typically call like overt narcissism, and it doesn't really take into account the whole structure. This is what we call the grandiose or the omnipotence, which most people identify. They know about that type of narcissistic behavior. So the whole grandiose sense of self is very complicated, but I just want to mention that it encompasses both that overt type of, I need to be the center of attention, risk-taking, look at me, I need to be admired. But at the same time, it also includes that more vulnerable side. So all those outward behaviors, we call them compensatory. In other words, they're there to defend against that more vulnerable, shameful side of oneself, which anybody who's suffering with these traits, or anybody listening who's treated somebody like this, they know that when there are moments of like what we call a narcissistic slight, a disappointment of any sort, even everyday separation sometimes can make them oscillate between feeling like they're on top of the world to feeling very vulnerable. And then maybe sometimes they even end up over drinking, turning to drugs, masturbation, pornography, to the bedroom sometimes if they really collapse and they can't get out of bed or go to work for a period. And all that happens because the underlying structure, and this is just one way to define it, and I know it's very complicated, but we think that they have a very fragile sense of self, which means that their self-esteem is very precarious, and they're always trying to regulate their self-esteem. So you could see then how that omnipotent sort of attention-seeking behavior could work really well to sort of puff up their image and make them feel better. So that's very high level, I would say, way of maybe us jumping into it or just
right.
It.
Yeah. One of the things I'm curious about is that a little bit of, being honest here is that I think for a lot of people, we don't find narcissistic people necessarily always that fun to be around. And maybe even, I think for a lot of us, I know even in my grad school days, when I was learning about personality disorders, it was kind of like, okay, these are things that are just hard to treat and hard to deal with. And so I think for a lot of us that are therapists, we think, oh, I don't want to work with these kinds of folks or that sort of thing. But you've kind of found a way to kind of connect with folks that are kind of meet those criteria for being having narcissistic tendencies. So what
Yes.
is it that you've kind of learned along the way around that, around connecting with those folks?
Yeah, this is, I would say, in my mind, there are again many different pieces to this, but if I had to sort of list them in importance, this would be the number one important thing. And this goes for anybody who's treating them or anyone who's listening to this who maybe feels like they're in a relationship with somebody like this and if trying to figure out how to negotiate that type of relationship, is appreciating the subjectively useful component of something that's maladaptive. But let me break that down, okay?
Right.
We say it's a defensive posture. I said it was compensatory. So if you could appreciate that if they're, they know it all, or they're arrogant, or sometimes they're critical or condescending, they're oftentimes very dismissive, like, I don't need you, because they know everything, so why would they need you? Appreciating that, what I mean is that that's part of the structure that holds them together. And if you can appreciate that, immediately your defenses will go down, Gordon, if that makes sense, because it's not just that they're doing this to you because you're incompetent or not capable, but it's that's what makes them feel better. That's what they need to survive. So the goal, initially at least, before we get deeper into the work, is appreciating that by way of what we call containment. And that's just a fancy word, but that means that you want to get as close as possible to their experience. Like that's what I was doing with those dialysis patients that I mentioned earlier.
Right.
Really trying to understand, not telling them what to do, not educating them on why they need to be on their dialysis and not skip the treatments. So it wasn't about education. It wasn't about ever telling them what to do, but it was about really appreciating how they choose to do it the way that they do, and then helping them understand how they come to those choices in life.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it's really just in therapeutic terms, it's really approaching, really kind of validating their experience. And even though we don't see it, the world the way they do, is really being able to just simply acknowledge that with someone. And that probably goes a long way in building that therapeutic relationship.
Yeah. And I just want to clarify one thing. I know you probably mean this, but for any of like your therapists that may be listening in your audience, so validation isn't just agreeing or just understanding. Like I call that like false empathy, like, oh yes, that must have been so hard, when your wife retired to the bedroom early, and she left you feeling so alone. I don't think of it that way. The way that when I say containing, it's like what you're trying to do is take in their experience and then what we call detoxify it. In other words, they tend to come in and complain. Let's just use that as an example. They like to complain and everything is everybody else's fault, which is very common with personality disorders. It's never their fault. It's always somebody else's fault. So what you're trying to do is you take that in, what we call detoxify it. In other words, you want to give it back to them in a language, in words. Like this is the development of what we call verbal language, which they don't have because they can't express feelings because again, they're so defended against that. So what we do is we take it in, we ask inquisitive questions to get as close as possible and try to understand it from their perspective. And then we can give it back to them in a way that we call, I'm just using sort of Beyond's language, that's a psychoanalyst, detoxified. In other words, in a way that makes sense to them. Now they can begin to get into a more regulated state of mind and begin to think about another side of themselves, which again, I mentioned earlier, is that more vulnerable or shame side they're not always in touch with, because that's typically what we call split off. It like disappears because all you see is this is the kind of narcissism, that more grandiose presentation.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So what have you found that helps kind of create a catalyst for change for folks that are working through this kind of personality disorders or narcissism, that kind of thing?
One of the main things is, since they're not in touch with this other side of themselves, because it's like fragmented or it's split off, we call this integration. So in other words, we want to help them get more integrated so they can be exposed and begin to be able to tolerate and work through a whole range of different feelings. So this way they don't need to get rid of them. Like again, just to use the example from the dialysis unit, it was much more pleasant to be in Atlantic City. But also, like I say that to you, I kind of smile when I say it, and I think you did too. But you could also appreciate at the same time that this way they don't have to feel any vulnerability. They don't have to feel ashamed. There's no thought about all of what it means to be living with a disability, that you are dependent on a machine and on the staff. And by the way, just as a quick side note, people with these characteristics have a very hard time being dependent on anybody or anything. Remember, because they know everything, so they don't need anybody. So one of the main, just to go back to your question, is helping them develop a more integrated, complex sense of self, where they can let different parts of themselves in that have been defended against, split off, and projected their whole life. And then as they become more integrated, they don't need to get rid of these feelings. and getting rid of the feelings means then they don't need to be above everybody or act out in certain ways, like I mentioned before, maybe with drinking or isolating themselves or whatever they may do. Yeah.
Right, right. I know when we were having our conversation on your podcast, one of the things that kind of the flip side of this, besides the person that is being diagnosed with or has narcissism, I don't know, struggles with narcissism. I don't know the best way to frame that, but how it affects relationships and the people that are around them. And so I think where we kind of left off in our conversation was just, and I think a lot of us have had these conversations with different clients, those of us that have been doing this a while, where you've got maybe a narcissistic partner and they're really trying to figure out, okay, do I stay? Do I leave? How do I navigate all this? And then also just their own, kind of the trauma of being in a relationship like that.
Yes.
I was just thinking maybe the question is, what are your thoughts on that? The healing on the relationship side.
I love this part because I call it like low-hanging fruit. I mean, it's unbelievable how much progress you can make with these patients once you engage their curiosity, because oftentimes they do come in struggling in a relationship, but relationships are so complicated, they don't always see all of what's going on. And what I tend to do initially is I help them. If, like, let's say you're in this relationship and you identify, or you're thinking that your partner may be, have these narcissistic characteristics, you're not ready to leave that relationship for whatever reason. You've been with them a long time. There are very genuine moments as well. Maybe you have kids or finances that are intermingled. So then the question becomes, how do you manage a relationship with somebody who you think has these characteristics? And a couple of things that I typically help them with, again, this is the low-hanging fruit that I mentioned, is
let's take a quick break.
Are you tired of feeling like you're walking on eggshells all the time? Do you feel drained, confused, or like nothing you do is ever good enough? Are you stuck in a cycle of elation, then criticism and confusion? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about narcissistic traits and dynamics and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's also space for real conversation. This is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes to join us. Okay, I hope to see you there. The first step, if there are steps, is don't get caught up in fighting over reality, because reality is very complicated, and then you're just going to go back and forth and saying who was right and who was wrong and what happened 5 years ago when you did this. So the first step is not becoming caught up in reality, but trying to understand your partner. And this goes for any relationship, by the way. And these things just happen more naturally, I think, for people who are maybe more neurotic or not personality disordered. So the goal is to understand. And we do that, again, I know I mentioned this earlier, but it's such an important piece of it, by asking inquisitive questions. So the same way I describe that I work with these individuals who have these narcissistic characteristics, I always encourage the partners or the children, right, of maybe their parents have these characteristics, is to always take an inquisitive stance, to try to understand their mother, and why she says the thing that she says. Now, Gordon, I promise you, this stuff seems so simple, but I was just doing an interview a few weeks ago, and this woman spontaneously gave an example of a family dynamic. I just posted this actually on my podcast. And immediately I said, you're arguing with her over reality. Like, you went in and you're talking to this mother-in-law. That was the example, right? And you're telling her what the truth is, but you don't seem interested at all in understanding her perspective. So that would be the first place to start, is being curious, gathering information, and then checking with them. That would be, again, I'm not trying to give schematic steps, but it would be then you listen and then you check with them and say, hey, did I get this correct? So I'll just give a very simple example. Your husband gets upset with you, or if again, clinicians are mostly listening to this, a patient comes in and they complain about their husband, right, who gets upset because you overcooked the burger, right? I'm just kind of making this up, but you overcooked the burger and they're yelling. So then the first step is to do what? To try to understand what's going on here and start to ask questions. And this is the same thing that I do. And what I find out is when you slow it down, you can say, tell me, what was going through your mind? So what happened? This is what I do, by the way, with patients. When they handed you that burger and you recognized it was overcooked, right? And what you typically hear more often than not is they don't know me, or they didn't listen to the way I like my burger cooked. And now you
Mm-hmm.
see you're getting to something different. You're not staying at the manifest level of the anger. You're
Mm-hmm.
listening for the deeper emotions behind underneath the anger, which are
Mm-hmm.
what? That this guy blew up because he felt like he wasn't being heard. Now, I'm not condoning that behavior, by the way. We'll talk
Mm-hmm.
about that too, at some
Yeah.
point, in terms of creating boundaries. But that's last. That's typically what you hear from the first recommendation is, well, you need to create firm boundaries. But my
Mm-hmm.
first step and second step is like gathering information, checking in with them, and listening for what the feelings are below the anger. I know there's a lot more to say, but let me pause and just
Mm-hmm.
see how this lands with you.
Yeah,
And
yeah. One of the things, and this is a dynamic that happens even when in any couple really, is that we can get into this dynamic of criticism and defensiveness.
mhm,
And once it goes there, then it just tends to escalate. I mean, as far as, like you said, trying to hash out the facts of the situation
yes,
is not going to get you anywhere because my facts are going to be different than your facts
yep,
because my perspective is different from your perspective.
hmm
It's kind of like an example that comes to mind for me is just kind of like if I showed you the front of a book and I said, okay, what is this book? And you would probably read the title and that sort of thing. And I would say, well, what is the predominant color of the book? And usually there'll be some kind of graphic or whatever. But if I flip the book around and say, what is the title? You can't really know it unless you take the book and maybe start reading the fine print on the back of the book.
hmm
But the truth is that if you don't know the title or you said it doesn't have a title, from your perspective, that's correct because you're not seeing it. And so
hmm
the truth of the matter is both sides of the whole of situations. And so when, and thinking about working with couples is trying to be able to get them to a place where they can kind of see the other's perspective. And
yes,
they, like you said earlier, get curious
yes.
with their partner. That keeps them from getting escalated or emotionally flooded or however you want to say that. That's a huge dynamic change for
Yeah, and
most
I
people.
I love that analogy you use because when you said if you flip it around and you can't see the title anymore,
Mhm.
it's like you have to read the fine print or something. Like you got to look, you got to delve into it, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that's very similar to what I was trying to get at, which is what's the goal here? Do you want to get to know your partner? And I heard this before. It's like the other key is like you don't label, like don't label people. We're not here to like label. So sometimes they'll say, well, he's a narcissist or he's a covert narcissist. And I told him that. And it's like, okay, but the goal is to try to get to know him and not label him. But then they say, well, but it's true. He is a covert narcissist. So why shouldn't I use that language? It's not helpful to use that language because I could tell you, like, I'll stop them immediately because I know what's coming next, which
Mhm.
is, it too. He's about to explode because
Mhm.
that's a very dehumanizing way to just, to talk to somebody. It's not a way to understand somebody by slapping a label on them. So that's
Mhm.
another technique. Gordon, I could keep going, but I'll just say one
Yeah.
more thing, okay?
Sure. Yeah. Keep going.
One thing again with couples that I find really helpful is to stay focused on the present and what we call process, not content. So, in other words, don't go back to the past and what happened 5 years ago. Like, we have enough work to do right here in the moment between
Mhm.
just helping the two of you begin to communicate without all these distortions, Gordon, that you mentioned earlier, right? Because everybody sees things through their own lens. I mean, you know this. People with personality disorders, unfortunately, tend to distort it. Their lens distorts things based on their own history and their own representations of people, based on how they've been treated in the past. So
Mhm.
that's like you got to deal with misinformation that's coming in. See, we have plenty to do right now. We have to contain, we have to get them regulated, we have to get them curious, then we have to clarify or clear up any distortions that are going on in the moment. So you
Mhm.
don't need to go back, not initially, at least in the beginning phases of treatment. You don't need to go back to what happened 15 years ago or 10 years ago. And by the way, it
Mhm.
gets so distorted, like it turns into what we call a screen memory. It has
Yeah.
layers and layers of fantasy over it that it's just so far from reality. It's not valuable to go
You're
back
right.
there.
Right. Right. Yeah. That's that same approach. Yeah, and I'm glad you said that. Is that working with other therapists, particularly I'm a AAMFT approved supervisor, so I work with a lot of
Hmm.
folks that are working through the licensure process.
Uh-huh.
And I think so many people get intimidated by just working with couples in general because they're afraid of the content. And if you can take that content away and just look at the process and look at, okay, how are they communicating with each other right now?
Hmm.
What is happening in the background? When somebody says this particular thing in this particular tone of voice, what's the response to that? And so
Hmm.
you can change the responses. You can't change the content. You're going to get down a rabbit hole of, like we talked about, is the truth for both people is something different. Yeah.
Yep.
And so getting really focusing on the process of what's going on rather than the content
Yes.
is, I think, one of the most important things for people that are working with couples.
Yeah. Can I add one more? Because I'm so excited.
Sure.
The audience
Yeah.
is a lot of, like you said, like mental health professionals, maybe who are working
Yes.
in this field.
Right.
So another critical thing to do when you're working with these patients. I love this, by the way, Gordon, because I don't typically get to talk about this end of things because it's always talking about relationships and people who are in these relationships with somebody, right?
Right.
But now
Right.
we're talking about how we help somebody heal or how we heal relationships. Another thing is do not think about interpretation. And what I mean by interpretation is something that's out of their level of awareness that they're not seeing, that's just too far away, making it conscious. So we call it making the unconscious conscious, like maybe making a link. So I'll give you an example. You get very upset with your husband when he drinks on a Saturday, Sunday afternoon and watches football. But then you give an interpretation. Well, I remember you telling me that your father drank. That kind of stuff typically upsets somebody with a personality disorder because they're not necessarily in that moment of making a link between this is my father that I'm upset with and not my husband. And it means nothing to them. And typically it just gets them upset with you. And they don't have that capacity to make those links. So another thing that I teach, therapy, because I also supervise and I teach, but one thing I help them work on, which is really hard, because I think therapists believe that they're supposed to be making like interventions or linking things together, going after the content like we described earlier. But what I encourage them to do is just stay so close in the moment and just say, tell me what happened that moment when you heard him rip open a beer. What went on inside of you? What was the immediate thought and feeling? And you'll help them get to that historical stuff with their parents if that's what's there and they're ready to go there. But I would always advocate not to force it. Just stay in the moment with them. That's where you'll get the most bang for your buck.
Right. Yeah. And truthfully, that's the only place where you can effectively create any changes in the moment. That's the truth with that.
Yeah, when they get later into the treatment and they're developing more of a capacity to really slow down and reflect and then try to make connections and understand why they behave. Yeah, at that point, then maybe you could give that kind of interpretation where they're so close to it and you feel like they could use it in a way, that's beneficial. But typically that takes a long time and sometimes isn't even part of the process. I think you mentioned it last time, Gordon, just the process of helping them mentalize. I think we spoke about this. In other words, to think about their own thoughts and feelings, but also somebody else's, like their partner's.
Yes.
It's a major accomplishment. People always ask, can you really treat a narcissist? Can you help them? Do they really heal? Well, heck, this is part of healing right here, to develop a capacity for mentalization and be more thoughtful about what Gordon is thinking. Imagine that you could think about, that's a major accomplishment. Sure.
Right. Yeah. Oh boy, this is fascinating things to talk about. I know we've got to be mindful of our time, but I'm curious for you, Anthony, in just thinking about helping couples, just in this context of maybe a person is trying to figure out how to navigate through a narcissistic relationship. And they are really thinking about, do I want to stay in this or not? And also being able to, how they can set boundaries with the narcissistic person, because I think that's one of the things that's, I think, important for just any individual is know how to create boundaries for yourself.
Yes.
But in just thinking with a narcissistic relationship, it becomes even more, I think, a little more of a challenge. So I'm not sure if my question is making sense, but just thinking about it in that context of working with the person that is maybe in a narcissistic relationship. You mentioned the low-hanging fruit of just really focusing on the present and that sort of thing. But what are some other things that you found that are helpful with those people?
So you mentioned boundaries. I could speak to that because I think what happens if you really put in the effort and you try, like all of what you and I are discussing today, and in our last episode as well that we recorded, and nothing is really working, like and that's if you're really trying and you're trying to be inquisitive, asking the questions, all the things we mentioned, right? And they're still very, like, let's say, disrespectful. Like, I'll just give you, again, I love examples, just a very short one. I'm treating this fellow. He's a grown adult, but his mother's very involved in his life and his treatment, too much so. And for months and months, Gordon, probably almost like a year now, she would send me very abusive emails. And I would try to contain it and say, we're here for him. And let's try to work together to do what's in his best interest. And by the way, the mother is abusive towards me because her son is getting better. And when you have a covert narcissistic parent, they cannot tolerate the separation. So she needs to interfere in the treatment process. But that's a whole nother story. So finally, I get to the point where I say to her something along the lines of, this relationship no longer works for me, right? So that's creating a boundary. But I'm not breaking it off. But then you put in a consequence. if you behave or send me one more abusive email, right, then I will block your email and you will have to only correspond with me through your son. And immediately her tone changed. Well, at the moment, at least, I can't predict what's going to happen in the future.
All right.
But she has become much more respectful because I don't think she wants to lose that relationship with me. But she needs now to contain her. Well, the boundary actually, the boundary helped contain her. So when nothing else was working and I could not contain her, and again, she's not my patient. I think I would have worked with her differently. But then I had to put that boundary. And the important thing about a boundary is you have to give the boundary, like, don't talk to me this way again, and a consequence. Like, this is what's going to happen. And I'm not blaming her and I'm not upset. I just say this relationship doesn't work for me. That's the emphasis. So she can't get upset and argue with me because it just doesn't work for me.
Right.
You know? So.
Right. Yeah, I love that because I think it's as much as anything, it's really, I think with boundaries is being able to have a firm no and being able to stick by that. And I like that piece too about what are the consequences if they don't follow through on what you're requesting of them.
Yeah, and it's not that I'm punishing. I'm not humiliating this woman or punishing her. I'm just saying I can't participate in this kind of relationship. It's like the parent who gets so frustrated with their child and timeout doesn't work, and the child doesn't listen or they run out. Well, at some point you may have to say, if you don't knock it off, I'm going to take a timeout. Right? Put yourself in timeout, right? Instead of trying to control, of trying to control your child. So I'm not trying to control this mother. I'm just saying this is the boundary. This is where I'm comfortable. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Oh boy. Well, this is just great stuff. Again, I guess we need to be mindful of our time, and I'm sure, Anthony, I'm thinking out loud here, but I'm thinking we might want to continue this conversation even more.
Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.